The American Jewish romance with Israel is both ordinary and extraordinary. American Jewish concern over Israel isn't so very different from the long-distance nationalism of Cuban Americans, Irish Americans, Indian Americans, and indeed Palestinian Americans who live physically in the States, but virtually or vicariously over there. But the differences are no less important and make this, I think, a special case. For one thing, very few American Jews are of Israeli origin. Israel has always been, in some sense, a projection screen for American Jews, a phantasmagorical region of the mind as much as an actual country. Another more salient distinction is the exceptional position that Israel occupies in American foreign policy. Israel is America's closest ally in the region, apart from Saudi Arabia. In spite of its small population, the Jewish state is by a considerable margin the biggest recipient of U.S. aid, $3 billion annually. Israel is also an occupying power. Born of a war in which 2/3 of the indigenous population was driven from their land, Israel went on to expand its borders still further in 1967 when it conquered the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. Today there are 500,000 Jewish settlers in the occupied territories who enjoy all manner of state subsidies and privileges, while Palestinians under occupation suffer indignities and humiliations too numerous to mention. The situation is not that much better for Palestinian citizens in Israel, who are increasingly treated as a fifth column, despite their loyalty to a state that has shown them little affection over the years. Israel's occupation is the longest in modern history, and the Israeli government appears to be in no hurry to end it, particularly if it can change the topic to Iran's nuclear program or the threat of Islamism. Unconditional support for Israel is not the only reason the United States is viewed with suspicion and hostility in much of the Arab and Muslim world, but it is certainly one of the reasons, and a very big one. So the American-Jewish relationship with Israel is of considerable geopolitical significance, and one does not have to buy into specious and indeed anti-Semitic notions of Jewish power to see that American Jews have played an important role in establishing the parameters of discussion of what can and cannot be said on this subject, and arguably in shaping America's policy in the region. The best-known example of such influence is the so-called Israel lobby, which has been an unconditional supporter of the settlement enterprise and of Israel's many wars. And now that lobby is very hard at work, stirring up panic about the Iranian nuclear program. The lobby does not speak for most American Jews, but it has been successful in bullying its critics to the point where it has convinced many, if not most people, that we stand united behind Israel, right or wrong. So much for the joke that if you get 2 Jews in a room, you have 3 opinions. The idea of unanimous and unconditional Jewish support for Israel has always been a myth. As Norman Finkelstein, one of our panelists, points out in his new book, Knowing Too Much, the American Jewish romance with Israel was fostered by the 1967 war, when Israel became a key US ally, and by the emergence of Holocaust memory. It is a product, in other words, of politics and history, not of something primordial and static. And some of the most eloquent critics of Israeli policy, and indeed of Zionism itself, have been Jews, such as Henry Siegman, Tony Judt, our distinguished guests, not to mention Hannah Arendt and I.F. Stone. This is by no means an accident. The fit between Israel and American Jews, with their strong traditions of liberalism and universalist ethics, was never a natural one. Jewish liberal supporters of Israel had to look past or deny its unappetizing human rights record. But that has become much harder and harder to do. Norman Finkelstein argues in his new book that American Jews simply know too much now, and that in the battle for American Jewish hearts and minds, liberalism is winning out over Zionism. Norman has been making this argument for some time, but it is now being echoed in a different key by establishment figures like Peter Beinart, Roger Cohen, and, hold your groans, Thomas Friedman. Is this the end of the romance? I'm not sure. Support for Israel has long been one of the three walls of what the French Jewish writer Jean Daniel has called the Jewish prison, the others being Holocaust memory and the idea of being the chosen people. But there's no doubt that we are seeing an important and very encouraging explosion of debate among Jews around the question of Israel, which is, of course, also the question of Palestine. For there is, for all intents and purposes, only one real state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. The work of activist groups like Jewish Voice for Peace and of websites like Mondo Weiss and Open Zion have been very effective in demonstrating that Jews do not speak with one voice on the Middle East. And what I think is particularly exciting is that a growing number of young Jewish Americans on college campuses are joining forces with Palestinians and Arab Americans. They understand that the fate of Israel, Palestine, can't just be a conversation among Jews. I don't want to strike too optimistic a note. We may be seeing not so much the end of the romance as a growing diversification of American Jewish opinion. But after years of enforced conformity, it is a very welcome development, and it may yet create the conditions for new alliances and for a more concerted campaign against the occupation. It's my honor to introduce two speakers who have devoted themselves to the cause of peace and justice in Israel-Palestine. Speaking out on this issue has never been easy, and has more often than not been a thankless task. It requires courage, even fearlessness, a willingness to make enemies, and to endure all manner of insult, including the cheapest and most obvious, the charge of anti-Semitism or self-hatred, which effectively amounts to excommunication. Norman Finkelstein, the son of parents who survived the Warsaw Ghetto, is a political scientist and the author of numerous books, including Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, and his recently published Knowing Too Much, which has provided us with the topic of today's discussion. He first came to prominence in the 1980s with his devastating critique of Joan Peters' widely praised From Time Immemorial. Through a highly selective use of Ottoman demographic records, Peters had claimed that Palestine's Arab majority was not indigenous but had been attracted to Palestine by opportunities created by Jewish settlers. Thanks to Norman's forensic critique, that book is now understood to be a work of historicide, as credible as Holocaust revisionism. At a time when dissent on Israel was rare and harshly punished, Norman was willing to say what others did not dare to, and he has paid a heavy price, but he has continued to speak his mind and made it easier for others to do so. He and I have had our differences, mostly about matters of tone rather than substance, but I've always had deep respect for his work on Palestine, and I want to pay tribute here to his courage, to his commitment, and to the ethical vision that I believe underlies his work. Anna Baltzer, our other distinguished guest, is the national organizer with the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation and the co-founder of the St. Louis Palestine Solidarity Committee and St. Louis Jewish Voice for Peace. The granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, Anna first came into an awareness of the Palestinian question on a backpacking trip to the Middle East in 2003 when she met Palestinian refugees from the 1948 war. Justice in Palestine is now her life's cause. She is the author of Witness in Palestine, a Jewish-American woman in the occupied territories. She has made numerous television appearances, including an electrifying one, which I'm sure many of you saw, on The Daily Show with Dr. Mustafa Barghouti. In 2009, Anna received the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee's Rachel Corrie Peace and Justice Award and a certificate of commendation from the governor of Wisconsin for her commitment to justice in Israel-Palestine. She has given more than 500 lectures at churches, mosques, synagogues, and universities throughout the world, and she's barely 30 years old. Please join me in welcoming our two speakers.